All right, we are streaming and we are live, so we're going to begin. Good evening. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Centennial Institute webinar with Johnnie Moore on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom 2020 report. My name is Jeff Hunt. I have the wonderful privilege of serving as the Vice President of Public Policy for Colorado Christian University, where I help direct the university's think tank, the Centennial Institute. We are doing a whole series of webinars, and you can find them on our YouTube channel. We're covering everything from the biology of COVID-19 to American politics 2020 with Michael Barone, nursing on the front lines of COVID-19, the legal and economic implications of the stay-at-home orders, and much, much more. You can find all of that on our YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com/Centennial Institute, and you'll find all of our videos there. Today, we are so blessed to have Johnnie Moore with us, who is a commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's joining us to discuss USCIRF, which is the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, their 2020 annual report. The report documents religious freedom violations and progress throughout the world during the past year. In which countries is religious freedom getting better or worse? And how are religious groups treated in the Middle East, China, North Korea, Europe, other countries as well? What can America do to encourage international religious freedom? Let me show you a little bit about USCIRF. I'll read Johnnie Moore's bio, and then we're going to turn it over to him. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government commission, the first of its kind in the world, dedicated to defending the universal right to freedom of religion or belief abroad. USCIRF reviews the facts and circumstances of religious freedom violations and makes policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. USCIRF commissioners are appointed by the President and congressional leadership of both political parties. Johnnie Moore is a great friend of Colorado Christian University. He is the founder and CEO of the Kairos Company and president of the Congress of Christian Leaders. He is a reverend and is best known for his work at the intersection of faith and foreign policy, and as a presidential appointee as a commissioner for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He began his career at Liberty University, where he served as the school's senior vice president for communications, as well as their chaplain. He then served as chief of staff and vice president of faith content for the United Artists Media Group in Hollywood. Moore has advocated relentlessly for religious freedom in the Middle East, meeting on multiple occasions with regional leaders, including most heads of state across the Arab world. And in 2017, he participated in the drafting of the landmark Bahrain Declaration of Religious Freedom and Peaceful Coexistence in the Middle East. He is a recipient of the prestigious Medal of Valor from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and he's been named one of America's 25 most influential evangelicals. And like I mentioned, he's a great friend of Colorado Christian University. Johnnie, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be with you. And I am just such a fan of Colorado Christian University and the work of the Centennial Institute. So it's a real privilege to spend some time together.
Great. Well, tell us about the report. What's new? This USCIRF has been releasing reports now, I believe, since around the early 2000s. So tell us a little bit about this latest report.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a few data points just to understand the content of the report. This year, we named 14 countries as CPC recommendations, 15 countries on our special watch list. There are another 6, we call them entities of particular concern that are on the list. But in all, across the CPC list and the special watch list, we cover about 29 countries in detail this year. In the report, 14 of those countries, the commission by a majority vote. There are 9 commissioners. I was appointed by President Trump. I sit next to commissioners appointed by Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer. And we take votes. And so a majority vote is what determines where a country is on a list, if they're on a list. This year, there are 9 countries that we designated as countries of particular concern. So that's the highest level that the State Department also designates as countries of particular concern. So Jeff, these are countries like Burma and China and Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. And then in our role as an independent organization, we're also a type of watchdog. And so sometimes we have a different opinion on countries. So there are another 5 countries that the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom determined were CPCs that the State Department doesn't recognize as CPCs. They put them one tier down. So that's this year, that's Nigeria, Russia, Syria, Vietnam, and India, which was definitely one of the biggest pieces of news in the report this year. While it was far from unanimous, the Commission moved India from the special watch list to the CPC list. And what's also interesting, by the way, is in each of these chapters, if you look at the end of the chapters, you'll discover that there are often individual comments on certain countries, because in the legislation that created USCIRF, it specifically states that commissioners ought to be able to present their own point of view. So there's a collective decision that's a majority decision. But if a commissioner differs from the decision or wants to make an observation about the decision, they can put a comment. And so after some of these countries are comments, including after India, there are 3 comments, and I put one of them. And then there's the second level. So you have the CPCs and you have the special watch list. And so the special watch list is a little different, because in order to be a CPC, you have to meet all 3 criteria, which means you have religious freedom violations that are systematic, they're ongoing, and they're egregious. Okay, so if you meet all 3, then statutorily, according to the legislation, you are, and our guidelines, you're a CPC. If you meet 2 of those criteria, not all 3, but if it's either ongoing or systematic or egregious, then you'll be on USCIRF's special watch list. Okay, so we this year recommend that the State Department maintain 4 countries on their special watch list. That's Cuba, Nicaragua, Sudan, and Uzbekistan. And then we also add another 11 countries in this year's report to that special watch list. These are countries like Afghanistan and Algeria, Indonesia, Iraq, countries like that are added to the second tier. And in the USCIRF report too, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the negative things happening around the world, but we also like to highlight the positive things. And this year there was some good news. Countries like the Sudan, which, if you're a religious freedom watcher, and I know you've been for a long time, Jeff, this has been a passion of yours. You've invested a lot of your life and career in religious freedom. I think you're probably like me. I just never imagined that the Sudan would have any improvement whatsoever. And yet this year, after over 20 consecutive years of being on the CPC, the Sudan is now on the special watch list. And USCIRF played a big role in that. We met with the interim prime minister and Minister of Education, Minister of Islamic Affairs. We took a visit to the Sudan this year. In all, we made something like 11 or 14 country visits around the world. But after the revolution a year ago, the Sudan is actually changing as rapidly as any country in the world. And so while they have a lot of progress still to be made, this year, they actually moved in a good direction. They went from being one of the most infamous CPCs to being on the special watch list, and USCIRF can take some credit for that. The other country that moved positively was Uzbekistan, which the State Department last year had already moved from their CPC list to their special watch list. We were a little hesitant to do so because the difference between USCIRF and the State Department, there's kind of 2 differences. The State Department, when they're determining which country is on which list, they're taking into account all of the foreign policy considerations of the United States of America, right? So sometimes countries that should be on the list aren't on the list. Sometimes waivers are granted for countries that are on the list because the State Department's job is advancing American foreign policy. And so foreign policy plays a role into their list. USCIRF, we're totally independent. So we are, in fact, statutorily not allowed to take into account American foreign policy. We are obligated to look at these countries entirely objectively and report to the administration and to Congress. So Uzbekistan, for all kinds of reasons, including some real progress they had made, last year the State Department moved them down, but we decided to take a little more of a cautious approach to see if they continued making progress. We've deemed that they have continued making progress. And so this year we've gone along with the State Department as well. And we have a more optimistic view of Uzbekistan. But I should say, one of the things that they promised to do to the State Department, they promised to us that they would do it, and they still haven't done it, is to change a particular law that affects religious communities. So that's the big categories in the report. I guess I should add a few other things. One of which is USCIRF also reports on non-state actors. Okay, so not just countries, but we determine our highest level is a country of particular concern, but there are also entities of particular concern. So every year we're looking around the world and we're trying to decide which of these entities of particular concern has enough territory and enough political power and are unable to be contained by the government to be justified on that list. And this year, I think there's 6 of those on our list. So this would be like Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. It would be the Houthis in Yemen, the Islamic State of the Khorasan province in Afghanistan, the Taliban in Afghanistan. And this year we added a group from Syria, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in Syria. So there's six of those. And the very last thing is we also in this report really commend the Trump administration for progress that they've made on a number of fronts, unlike any previous administration, including the ministerials on religious freedom and money that's been invested in forming the international body to bring together countries to promote religious freedom. So in like 8 minutes, that's a summary of a 90-page, very well researched report. It's not perfect, and there are various degrees of disagreement among the commissioners, but I think the report also does a good job of reflecting those individual points of view as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Johnny. I do, for those watching, want to mention that you can ask questions in the YouTube or Facebook chat features, and we'll do our best to relay those questions to Reverend Moore. So make sure you're engaging there. Let's go back to why we have the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I know in the late 90s, folks like Frank Wolf, who's a representative in Congress, Sam Brownback, who's a U.S. Senator, Rick Santorum was passionate about this as well. We're looking at international religious freedom and the persecution of faiths that were taking place across the globe, and wanted to create an entity that could address that. But why does America care about the religious freedom in other countries?
Well, number one, it's a conviction. It's an American conviction. Our country was largely founded on this fundamental right of religious freedom. Our founders, one of the reasons why they went on their treacherous path to an unknown land across raging oceans was to have the opportunity to have freedom of religion. And so it is baked into the American idea. And actually, we believe that one of the reasons why the United States has become a country unrivaled in human history in terms of our freedom and our power and our prosperity and our human rights and all of these other things, democracy and our form, is because this fundamental freedom is enshrined in our national life. It is the first clause of the first sentence of our First Amendment. And this idea of religious freedom, we have a fundamental conviction that not only is it a right given by God to man, it's an inherent human right. If you look at it from a secular point of view, if you look at it from a more religious point of view, it's a right given from God to men, and so it's not for governments to take away. But we also believe that it works, and so when we promote American values around the world, we believe those values actually aren't American; they are transcendent. It's just that in the United States of America, we allowed them to become part of our rule of law, and the resulting effects have been our incredible success in history. And so on a fundamental level, we just believe in these ideals and they need to be transferred. Secondly, You can take religious freedom and you can lay it on top of all kinds of other factors around the world. And generally speaking, if you have a country that has religious freedom, you have a more stable geopolitical situation. And so it is in the national security interest of the United States of America, to have a world where religious freedom and the related first freedoms. For instance, there's a lot of talk these days about COVID-19 and what China knew and what they didn't know, and what the WHO knew and they didn't know, and what they said, and all of these things. Putting aside, any debates that are taking place. I have very pronounced views on that, which I've been more than happy to tweet over recent days. But what we do know is that there were doctors in China who were censored at the beginning of this crisis. It was reported in their own press, not in our press. We do know that there were business people, one in particular, a super affluent Chinese business person, who criticized the response of the Chinese government, and he was disappeared. We still don't know where he is. He was vanished. And so perhaps, if China was a country with more freedom of dissent and freedom of expression and religious freedom for that matter, it's a check and balance on power, right? So we believe it's the right thing to do, and it's policy that makes the world safer. Unfortunately, Jeff, though, sometimes the human rights community is very nervous about religious freedom because of that R word, religion, and there tends to be an allergic reaction in certain halls of secularism when it comes to religion. But we actually, many of us on the commission believe, I'm not sure this is a unanimous point of view, but I think it probably is, that if you have religious freedom, you generally have all the other human rights. It isn't always the case that if you have one of those other human rights that you have religious freedom. So it's a foundation for human rights.
That's exactly right. And I used to represent Open Doors USA, which serves persecuted Christians around the world. And I spent some time at the United Nations. And one of the arguments we made at the United Nations, utilizing research from a think tank out of London, was that religious freedom is one of those foundational freedoms that creates all the other freedoms, including free markets. When you have that tolerance, when you have that ability to coexist, even in light of our deepest differences, upon that, you can have freedom of speech, you can have free markets, you can have all the other freedoms that we enjoy, but the importance of religious freedom really does create a foundation for countries. We would meet with Egypt, we meet with lots of other countries to try to show them this perspective. It's not just about democracy, because that was kind of the push in foreign policy in the 80s and 90s. We just got to get countries to embrace democracy and then everything will work out. Well, we've seen that it hasn't worked out just because they have democracy. I think religious freedom, as you just mentioned, Johnny, becomes that foundational freedom upon which a lot of other freedoms can be built. And if you don't have religious freedom, you're not going to have stability, even if you have things like democracy.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. You take for instance, the perspective that democracy is simply a popular vote. Which there's a large portion of the human rights community that believes that the definition of democracy is just the popular vote. But that isn't the American definition of democracy. It is the popular vote is part of democracy, but it's not on its own. And whatever the political function, whatever the selection process is of society, that all has to fall in a system of rule of law and of checks and balances. And the ultimate check is when you can have the competition in the marketplace of ideas when it comes to what people feel the most deeply about, which is religion. And while this isn't the focus of the commission so much, I have a general bias that there's too little religious consideration in foreign policy whatsoever. It's often the X factor that if it's at the table, people understand other things. If it's left off the table, they can make catastrophic mistakes. Religious freedom is a part of that.
Now, we're both Christians, and I've served representing persecuted Christians, but USCIRF doesn't just focus on the treatment of Christians around the world. It reports on the treatment of all religious minorities. Talk a little bit about USCIRF's focus on serving religious freedom for all people.
Look, it is a fact that you don't believe in religious freedom at all unless you believe in religious freedom for all. Okay, USCIRF's mandate, and by the way, the mandate of the United States history of our First Amendment is religious freedom. This is at the heart of it. It isn't preferencing one religion over the other. It also means that you can say that, in the United States, for instance, we have a Judeo-Christian foundation, right? There were Judeo-Christian ideas that sort of shaped the way we thought about things. But from the very beginning, this was a country that believed that religious freedom meant religious freedom for all. And so part of the mandate of USCIRF, first of all, the legislation that created it, right? So is important to understand, because USCIRF doesn't just sit around the table and decide what they're going to focus on and how they're going to do it. We have some flexibility. But for the most part, the mandate of the commission is put in the bipartisan legislation originally passed by Democrats and Republicans over 20 years ago and updated just a couple of years ago. And one of the key factors in that legislation is that we are not to judge religious freedom on the basis of American standards of religious freedom, but on the basis of international standards for religious freedom. So, this is, in one sense, this is really, really wonderful, right? Because you can't say that USCIRF is advancing an American agenda, right? This is not some form of ideological colonialism in a different form. In fact, we can't even lawfully do our work on the basis of American law, right? We have to do our work on the basis of international law. The problem with that, though, is that the international system is increasingly a system that has been, on occasion, manipulated and abused by the very, very worst violators of religious freedom. And so somehow USCIRF, by holding up the ideal of religious freedom, is also holding the international system accountable. So we issued a statement a few weeks ago, for instance, when the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, somehow the Chinese had managed to become an elected member of the body there that will be responsible for selecting all of the human rights special rapporteurs for the next few years. So China, which is absolutely the worst violator of religious freedom and human rights, in my personal opinion, on the scale that they've done it and the way they've exported that around the world, now sits at a table to determine who the cops are going to be around the world when it comes to things like arbitrary detention and other human rights abuse, not to mention just religious freedom. So it's an advantage to USCIRF that we're to focus on international law. It is a disadvantage in the sense that really, really smart countries around the world have learned how to abuse international law, and they've done it long enough that they've changed the system a little bit. So we sort of go back to the ideal. But all that to say, it is our responsibility to look at the abuse of religious communities of all types in all places all around the world. So sometimes USCIRF is criticized by being another organization that focuses on just Christian persecution. Farthest thing from the truth. USCIRF absolutely focuses on Christian persecution. And we absolutely focus on the persecution of Muslims and Buddhists, and, by the way, people who don't believe anything at all, because the freedom of religion extends all the way to the freedom of belief. And the freedom of belief means that as a religious Christian, an evangelical nonetheless, I have to also fight for the freedom of religion of those who disagree with me on religious terms, either within my own religion, from a different religion, or because they don't believe anything at all. I have to fight for their beliefs too, or lack thereof. So this report is not what Open Doors does, and it's not what any of the other Christian persecution watchdog does. It is the only such report, and the first commission ever created to focus on this area in the whole world that focuses on religious freedom at a whole. Now, by the way, I should just say, aside from USCIRF, I am an enormous fan of Open Doors. I should say, a lot of my advocacy around the world on behalf of Christians, I've done with real help from the material that Open Doors has produced. And I had a wonderful privilege a few years ago to sit in Brother Andrew's home in the Netherlands and hear of his many stories. But Christian persecution is just one part of what USCIRF does.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the types of persecution that people experience, because it's not just outright targeting of people of different faiths, although there is a lot of examples of that. But you'll experience it. People experience in these countries blasphemy laws or restrictions on your ability to even change your faith. So kind of your faith is listed on your driver's license, to even more egregious forms of persecution, like what we're seeing among the Uyghurs in China. But let's maybe start specifically and then get broader into what they're doing to particular groups like the Uyghurs. But talk about what kinds of persecution people can face as a result of their religious beliefs.
Yeah, so it goes across the gamut, right? So you have police states, like North Korea, which a colleague of mine on the commission said in our press conference the other day, that North Korea is a prison masquerading as a state, and it has probably at least 50,000 Christians, in prison work camps of various forms. You have police states, you have terrorist states, you have failed states with terrorist actors, you have various forms of authoritarian regimes, and then you have modern Western democracies, or those who act like democracies, who have created an unsafe public environment for religious minorities. You have, in some circumstances, you have countries where the majority is persecuted by the minority, and then more often you have the minorities persecuted by the majority. But it goes across the gamut. So, for instance, one of my favorite chapters, if I can use such a profane way of referring to it, in this report is a new chapter, and I'd encourage everyone to read it. Maybe it's the first chapter you read in the new report. It's called Key Developments. And the chapter on key developments looks across the world and identifies other trends that aren't necessarily, sometimes they are, but don't have to be related to the 29 countries that we take a deep dive on. And those trends include attacks on houses of worship, right? We've had plenty of attacks on houses of worship in the United States of America. It includes blasphemy laws. USCIRF, in addition to this big, gigantic report, we did 19 other reports of various types last year. One was a comprehensive update on blasphemy laws across a large portion of the world. But did you know that a sophisticated, modern, affluent country like Singapore has a blasphemy law problem, right? I mean, this is, no one would put Singapore on the special watch list of the CPC, but even very, very modern, affluent countries can have these issues. You have also—
before you move off blasphemy, let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a fascinating approach to trying to prevent religious infighting, that type of thing that can happen. So basically what a country says is, you can't say anything bad about another religion. And if you're a Christian, for example, and you're saying that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and you're doing outward proselytization and you're trying to recruit people for the faith, well, by claiming that you have the truth and that other people don't, you're, quote, blaspheming other religions. And they try to pass it as if it's blasphemy on all religions. So you can't really say anything bad, period. It really becomes a violation of free speech, because in America, you have the freedom to be able to go into basically the free marketplace of ideas and to throw out there your perspective on religion, say why it's the best or the truth, challenge other people. And yet, even though we live with that type of freedom, we have more peace when it comes to religious freedom than countries that are trying to stop religious violence by claiming blasphemy laws. I mean, it's really a fascinating study in law.
It's one of the biggest challenges all around the world, and it's a challenge in a couple of different areas. One area has to do with the intermingling of politics and religion. The other area has to do with blasphemy laws that are more like hate speech laws, which a lot of which you were just talking about. And then thirdly, blasphemy laws in countries that are controlled by a majority religion, say, a country like Pakistan, where they've had an increasing problem with blasphemy laws, where by violating the letter of the law, it doesn't even have to be that you said something obviously offensive. You can live in a way that is acceptable. That nobody would say this is unacceptable, but if you violate a part of religious law and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, they can drag you in. Or sometimes it's interreligious. Like one of the most persecuted groups in the world is the Ahmadiyya Islamic community in Pakistan. It's a sect of Islam. It's all around the world, but it originated in Pakistan. And the blasphemy laws are used against the Ahmadiyya community in Pakistan because for many years these extremists have argued that they're not Muslims at all. So these are not Muslims. So if they say they're Muslims, they're guilty. And these are not always very, on the surface, they're easy issues to untangle, 100%. But there are nuances that make this a little more difficult because, for instance, even in the United States of America, there's a limit to freedom of speech, right? You can't go out and incite violence, right? If I go outside right now and I say you can go kill a bunch of people, then that is the limit to my freedom of speech. You can't go cry, the historic, example, which is still presented, as if it happened yesterday, but there've been some things since then, but crying fire in a crowded theater. There are like limits to freedom of speech. So nobody is saying there shouldn't be limits when it relates to inciting violence, for instance. But in the United States, you have the freedom to be offensive. You even have the freedom to be a bigot in the United States, as long as you aren't inciting violence. But in many of these, and I'm not a lawyer, and there are other nuances to that. But in many countries around the world, there is this effort to define hate speech as being offensive to a religious community or offensive to the state. And it really has nothing to do with religion at all very often. It has everything to do with political control. But what also makes this more complicated is one of the hardest areas to untangle is the nexus of religious freedom and other human rights and security, right? Because you have malign actors like Iran, who's a CPC in our report. They're there's no country in the world that's more guilty of violating religious freedom of certain communities than Iran. Chief among them, the Baha'i. Ironically enough, Iran has been putting flags of countries all around the world on a famous tower in Tehran in solidarity because of COVID-19. That tower was built by a famous Baha'i architect. And yet Iran viciously persecutes the Baha'i in their country. They accuse them of being Israeli agents and all of these other things. Same thing they accuse evangelicals of being. But you also have countries like Iran that export their political agenda often in the disguise or the cover of religion. And then when those religious political actors are a government, decides to intervene because there's a national security risk or there's a connection to Iran, then those people cry persecution, and so and by the way, what makes it even more difficult is that Shiite Muslims are terribly persecuted all around the world, viciously persecuted around the world. It is also true that some Shiite Muslims that are persecuted around the world, have been proven to be political agents of Iran. And so it's not that there isn't a need to balance security and religious freedom and security and human rights. It's just that it has to be done correctly. And the trend we're seeing all around the world is twofold. Either you have historic blasphemy laws that are arcane and need to get off the books, or you have governments overreaching in order to manage a political or national security risk. And I guess the third category would be the explicitly religiously motivated ones. In Nigeria, for instance, there are 10 or 12 states in northern Nigeria that actually have a form of Sharia law as part of their local governance. right? So Nigeria is a, is a federal country. It's a federal republic. So you have federal laws and you have state laws. And for many, many years, going all the way back to the way the British handled the local Islamic Emirates, there has been this slow and steady political movement to try to have both, to try to have Islamic law in certain Islamic majority places, and to also have, free elections and all of these things. And this is a very, very, very serious and complicated issue that it has as many gradations as there are places around the world.
Johnnie, USCIRF has now gone through 3 administrations, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, now the Trump administration. Can you talk about differences you're seeing in President Trump's leadership on religious freedom as opposed to what we saw under the Obama or Bush administrations?
Yes. Before I do, let me just say, back to the key developments chapter for just a second. Read the section on anti-Semitism in Europe, right? As USCIRF has historically not reported on Europe, but the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe in democracies, okay, is catastrophic and escalating. And so that's in our key developments chapter, and also the exportation of intolerance from China and its manipulation of the international system, important chapter. Okay, when it comes to Donald Trump and in the preceding administrations and religious freedom, let me first say what the report says, and then I'll give my personal opinion. Okay, so I'll divide the two. The report says a number of things, commending the Trump administration voluminously for the decisions that they have made to promote religious freedom. And I might add that this report is edited by the whole bipartisan commission, including Democrats and Republicans. And so there is a bipartisan point of view represented here that, objectively speaking, the Trump administration has prioritized religious freedom on an unprecedented level. Let me give a few specific examples. Right now, there's Sarah Macon, who, while we're talking right here, is sitting on the National Security Council in the White House as the senior director for religious freedom, and an assistant to the president of the United States. Back over 20 years ago, when the original IRFA legislation was passed, in that legislation, Congress said, we're doing 3 things. We're creating a bipartisan independent commission. We're creating an ambassador at large for international religious freedom, and we're creating a position on the National Security Council to make sure that religious freedom is at the table and part of our national security priorities. So for some reason, the commission was immediately created, the ambassador at large was immediately created. And in various administrations, the ambassador has taken more time than others, or vice versa, in order to appoint. But until the Trump administration, no preceding administration, Obama or Bush, had all the way back to Clinton when the legislation was passed, had elected to actually put someone in that NSC position. The Trump administration is the first person to do it. And she sits there every single day to ensure that the administration's religious freedom policies are at the national security table. Additionally, the Trump administration has aggressively sanctioned certain actors around the world for violating religious freedom. The Trump administration has had now 2 ministerials on religious freedom. They're having a third, coming up in a couple of months, I guess, pending COVID-19. But people don't understand the ministerial on religious freedom that took place last year was the largest human rights event of any kind ever held at the United States Department of State. Okay, so in every meeting that I'm aware of, if there's a question of religious freedom, in any bilateral or multilateral meeting, the topic has been brought up by the Trump administration. So the report says the Trump administration has done a tremendous job, in all of these areas. Now, let me just give my personal opinion. I'm an appointee of President Trump to the commission. I have lost track of how many meetings and phone calls I've been a part of at the White House. Religious freedom is my personal passion and has been my personal passion for my entire adult life. It is my area of expertise. I don't know a lot about a lot of other things. I know, very little about lots of other things. I know something about religious freedom. I have never, if I would have sat down a few years ago at 2016, and I would have written a wish list. God, if you would just please have a presidential administration do X, Y, and Z for religious freedom. And I put my wildest dreams on that wish list to promote this fundamental human right around the world. I would have, the Trump administration would have exceeded my wildest dreams already a year ago. Okay, so this is an administration that has ensured that religious freedom isn't part of the foreign policy agenda of the administration, but it is in the heart of the foreign policy agenda of the administration. And I would say where the administration gets bipartisan support in this highly polarized and political time, it receives it the most when it comes to this topic of promoting religious freedom around the world. And where the critics of the administration are most undermined are when they try to act like the administration isn't prioritizing religious freedom. Take China, for instance, during the trade negotiations, right? So you have the two largest economies in the world. We have a trade dispute; it has to be solved, right? And so certain people are saying, well, all the president cares about is this. He cares about the trade agreement. Simultaneously, the vice president delivered at the Hudson Institute the most direct speech calling out the human rights abuses of China of any American public figure, to my knowledge, ever in any administration. The Secretary of State has been unrelenting on his advocacy for the Uyghurs in China. In fact, some of us associated with the Trump administration have been accused of not caring enough about Christians around the world because we've been speaking up so much about Muslims, particularly the Uyghur Muslims, in China, which is an absurd accusation, to make, because we care about everybody. But it is absolutely the case that this administration, from my personal perspective, is beyond compare with any other administration when it comes to valuing religious freedom and advancing the religious freedom agenda around the world. That's my personal opinion, but the report's collective opinion aligns pretty closely with it.
Thanks for that insight, Johnny. Let's talk a little bit about particular places, China, India, and Europe. We've got just a few more minutes, so we can maybe go briefly through these. You mentioned Europe and anti-Semitism, something very concerning. We're even seeing some attacks on synagogues here in the United States. The growth of anti-Semitism in Europe, human rights abuses in China and India. Maybe we can go through those three areas in particular.
Yeah, Europe is something like 4 in 10 young European Jews in 2019. Remember, our report looks at 2019. It looks at the preceding year. It doesn't look at the first months of this year, the preceding year. 4 out of 10 young European Jews considered immigrating out of Europe last year because of anti-Semitism. This is in living memory of the Holocaust. The Jewish leaders in Germany at one point encouraged German Jews to not wear the kippahs in the streets because of the ongoing attacks. In countries like France and Germany and Sweden, and in the United Kingdom, around the very lively prime ministerial election, anti-Semitism in the historically Jewish affiliated Labour Party was at the very heart of the discussion. Prompting the Simon Wiesenthal Center, whose Rabbi Abraham Cooper participated in our hearing on anti-Semitism in Europe this year, because we also did a bunch of hearings on various subjects, and we produced a report out of that. His Simon Wiesenthal Center said that anti-Semitism in London was the #1 worst situation in the world last year. And so, the commission is thinking a lot about whether we've been, and this is again my opinion, I'm not meaning to represent the commission, but my perspective is the commission is thinking a great deal about whether we need to be dedicating personnel just to issues in Europe where we have historically looked at other more obvious violators of religious freedom. And this is really crazy considering we're, again, in living memory of the Holocaust. And it's not just Jews, by the way. There have been anti-Islamic laws in certain parts of the country that ironically have brought Jewish and Islamic leaders together in certain parts of the EU. Jewish and certain Islamic leaders have been brought together because of discrimination against them together. At the same time, Jews are concerned about anti-Semitism, and Muslims are concerned about certain types of Islamophobia. And so this is a big issue. Even this morning, by the way, the German government, and USCIRF has no opinion on this yet, but because it's just new. But if you're watching, just this morning, the German government finally designated Hezbollah, as a terrorist organization. It just happened this morning. But by the way, it's not just anti-Semitism in Europe; it's anti-Semitism around the world. The Houthis in Yemen, which is one of our groups, obviously anti-Semitic. A lot of their persecution of Baha'is are on the basis of this conspiracy theory that Baha'is are agents of Israel. So it's pervasive. On India, as I said at the very, very beginning, of our time here together, India was probably the biggest news out of this report. The commission voted to elevate India on its list. It was hugely controversial in the country. It prompted the External Affairs Ministry to immediately issue a statement. India hasn't even allowed USCIRF in many years. It was not a unanimous decision. In fact, I'm one of 3 commissioners that have comments at the end of the India chapter, qualifying that decision in various aspects. But the majority view of the commission, as reflected in this report, is that India crossed a line last year in what has been a period of increasing concerns about religious discrimination, particularly targeting Muslims. But they crossed the line when you combine the CAA with a national register of citizens, which has already been implemented in Assam. It affords the Indian government the opportunity to provide special discrimination, principally against Muslims. And so the majority view of the commission, again, not the unanimous view of the commission and their qualifying comments related to it, and even dissents, is that this grand democracy around the largest democracy in the world has taken for granted its pristine constitution and its pluralistic history, and is messing around with state-level anti-conversion laws, discussions about a national anti-conversion law, discriminating against NGOs, passing legislation which targets individual religious or ethnic groups. And so the majority of the commission deemed it now worthy of being a CPC. The criticism of that is, how do you put India, the world's largest democracy with a pristine constitution and incredible historic pluralism, on the same level as China and North Korea and Iran and all of these obviously bad actors? That criticism comes from a place that probably doesn't understand the legislation that created USCIRF, because USCIRF is not allowed to compare countries to each other. They have to analyze that individual country, and they have to, and to a degree, it's a subjective decision because it's by a majority vote. So does the country meet, are there religious freedom violations systematic, ongoing, and egregious? Is it systematic in that it targets whole groups of people, and not just targeting whole groups of people, but expansively so? Is it ongoing, as in it's continuing, it's not an isolated incident? And is it egregious? So does it meet the criteria of saying, like, this is the highest type of offense, resulting oftentimes in death or a certain type of discrimination or imprisonment or torture, all of these sorts of things? That can be done by a government, these things, or it can be aided and abetted by a government because of their inaction. And so that was the majority view, though, again, not unanimous, of the commission. And then finally on China, it's a great place. The world made a decision several years ago to allow China to enter into a form of normalization that has made China the second largest economy in the world, a vast military power, and a country that can only be, while the distance is vast, can only be compared to the United States and its influence around the world. The United States is still immensely more powerful, immensely more prosperous, and obviously in our rule of law and all of our other institutions beyond compare. But China is decidedly number two. And what China has done, particularly under President Xi, and this is I've called it, not the Commission's words, but I've called it a relapse to the Cultural Revolution, where China had been opening and had been treating certain religious communities better. President Xi has taken China back to the old tactics of the old way and has taken upon himself the mantle of Chairman Mao. And again, my words, not the Commission's words, the best way I know how to describe it. So he's trying, and his leadership of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, they're trying to have both. They're trying to be the leading nation in the world because that is their ambition, economically, militaristically, every other form of power and prosperity. They're trying to be the top nation in the world, and they're also trying to be the same historic abuser of human rights and religious freedom that they have always been, and that we had hoped that they were changing, only a few years ago. Now they've decided they want to be both. And what we've decided as a commission is we've said, sorry, you can't be both. You got to pick, okay? You have to decide whether you're going to be welcome to the party of nations and be respectable in the world and have your seat, your unparalleled seat at the table, or you've got to decide whether you're going to be a country that makes people disappear, that inters millions of Muslims because of policies, that disappears a 6-year-old Tibetan Buddhist leader, the Panchen Lama, that decides that you're going to arbitrarily shut down religious communities, entirely shut down national religious life, every chance you can get, violate every human right you can possibly imagine. But what concerns us, not only about the total objective reasoning around China being without question a CPC, and in my opinion, the worst of all the CPCs, because they have the power, they don't have to be. Some countries you can argue that if they can't survive unless under their present system, unless they keep their fist tight. It's still wrong. It's still a violation. We still hold them to account, but it's an equilibrium. China has the capability. They have the prosperity. They have the Chinese people, unbelievable people. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. I'm talking about the Communist Party of China. They have the capability of being a nation we can all admire. And yet they have chosen to violate this inherent human right and human rights like that any chance they can. And enough is enough. And we've said enough is enough. And I think the Chinese government has sufficiently noticed, because in the press conference just yesterday with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, China Daily, which is a publication largely connected to the Communist Party of China, primarily a publication that publishes outside of China, has double or triple the circulation outside of China as inside China, asked the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about the USCIRF report, which tells me that they're paying attention, and they should be paying attention, because we have no intention ourselves of giving them a single inch as long as there are innocent people around the world who fear another breath or the freedom that they deserve simply because of their choice to believe in something or to not believe at all. But the other piece of this, and I'll finish with this, Chip, China is now exporting their intolerance around the world. They're buying influence. They are essentially embracing a neo-colonialism, tying certain countries to their power in exchange for investment in building airports and roads and infrastructure, and manipulating the international system in a way I talked about earlier. And so one of the things that we shine a very, very bright light on in this report is the way China is exporting its intolerance. The light is blinking red, and it's time for the Chinese government to take a different path. And President Xi could lead that path. He could do it. He could see the handwriting on the wall and pivot the country. He's done it before. He could do the right thing. And my feeling is he's going to be celebrated by more than 1 billion Chinese people in the country, and Chinese expatriates and Chinese citizens of other countries all around the world. And if Sudan can change, then surely China can.
Wow. Johnnie, thank you so much. I appreciate your passion on this issue, all the work that you and USCIRF do to advance that fundamental human right of religious freedom. As we close here now, how can people continue to follow the work that you're doing, the work of USCIRF? How can they get involved in advocating for religious freedom internationally?
Just educate yourself and raise your voice. And raising your voice means in the public. You can tweet. You follow me on Twitter at Johnnie M. You can follow at USCIRF. Go to uscirf.gov. Educate yourself on what's going on around the world, and then raise your voice and tell other people about it. But most importantly, tell your politicians about it. Your local elected officials. I am reasonably involved in politics myself. And someone told me one time, they said, what's more powerful than showing up in a senator or congressman's office in Washington, D.C.? Show up in their local office. That's more powerful because a senator or a member of Congress or their staff, every day, lots of people go through their DC office. But if all of a sudden in one day, 10 people show up in a local office in a state talking about the same thing, they have to pay attention. And we still live in this unbelievable country, despite our polarization and our freewheeling democracy, where we fight like mad in the public square. But when it's the right thing to do, 90% of the time we pull together and we get it done. And if you care about this issue, educate yourself and raise your voice, but take it all the way to your elected officials, because there is an unrivaled power in the world when the American Congress and our elected leaders decide to take action on something like this. So that's the advice I would give you.
That's great, Johnnie. And when we were working on religious freedom issues years ago, we noticed that we weren't getting the concerns of elected officials on this issue. So we created a scorecard to hold them accountable, and we saw them shift and really start to take this issue more seriously. The issue of religious freedom has really grown over the last few years. I remember meeting in the early 2000s, you could barely get enough people in a room to care about this issue. Now we have entire agencies focused in on it. It's a hallmark policy priority of the President of the United States and the Vice President, who I want to thank for all the good work they're doing on behalf of religious freedom, for members of Congress who have made this a serious priority. But a lot of it started with really Frank Wolf and just a handful of people recognizing the serious problem that this was and taking action. And I think for those of us that are Christians, there's a number of organizations, but when I look at Open Doors and Voice of the Martyrs, they have news services. They're tracking what's happening to the persecuted church around the world. And we have to remember as Christians, now this is separate from USCIRF, but we are Colorado Christian University that's hosting this. These are our brothers and sisters who are suffering. And we get to go to church. We get to share our faith publicly. We get to be bold to fulfill the gospel mission. They are meeting secretly. They're often persecuted. The church is thriving under that persecution in many ways, but we have a responsibility to care for our brothers and sisters to the very best of our ability in whatever way we can. And I want to encourage you to check out Open Doors and Voice of the Martyrs. Johnnie, thank you again for being with us. For those of you that are watching, if this is a time that you are looking to change your life, I encourage you to check out ccu.edu. Get that degree that you've always been looking to get. You can get it now. Colorado Christian University, especially its online program, has over 7,000 students that are part of it all over the world. You can be a part of that as well. Over 80% of those students get financial aid. And so we want to help you. The average class size, only 11 people, and you can choose from over 80 programs. So you're going to get that personal attention from your instructor with a whole variety of different programs, all rooted in that Christian conservative worldview. So check out ccu.edu and get that degree that you've been looking for right now. Thank you all for being a part of this. I do want to raise your attention to the fact that next Thursday, a week from today, is the National Day of Prayer. And CCU will be involved in a whole lot of activity around that, including 72 hours of prayer that you can be a part of. Go to ccu.edu to check that out. And we'll be hosting a big conference call to kind of kick off that effort. But next week, 1 week from today, this is the National Day of Prayer. Thank you again, Johnnie. We're so grateful for the work that you're doing. God bless you and the whole commission at USCIRF. Any closing words, friend?
No, it is a golden time for religious freedom, Jeff, and we have a president and an administration that's prioritizing it. The truth is, he probably deserves the Nobel Prize for the way in which he's prioritized it. But we can't rely on our political leaders, even those who prioritize this issue. It ought to be our issue. Every one of us has a part to play.
That's great. Thank you again, Johnnie. This is the golden age of religious freedom. Let's leave this legacy for our children and grandchildren, a freer world as a result. Thank you all for watching. God bless you.